You hear me? Hello. I would kindly ask you to take your seats. Before we start the session, we would like to take a group picture in which we would like to say a hi to the people who could not join us. So please take your seats. Try to fill in the gaps if possible. And I will ask you to wave gently like this, not to hide your neighbors. We're going to take a few pictures. Oh, we're going to wait a few people sitting. Please wait. Keep waving.
Look in the camera, please. 1, 2, 3.
Nice crowd, yes. Thank you.
Okay. So we can start and we can open the Analytical Week. So first of all, I introduce myself. I am Pier Cristiano Brazzale. I am president of IDF since November 2020. I come from Italy, just arrived by car, so sorry, but I'm a little bit tired. So I am a dairy entrepreneur, and I am agronomist. We have a dairy company in Italy. We have several plants in Italy, in Czech Republic, in China. I'm producer of PDO cheeses and butter. And I work in IDF since 2010. I am member of several standing committees, Standing Committee in Environment, Dairy Science and Technologies, Nutrition and Health, and I'm really happy to be here and to see a lot of people here for the Analytical Week organized by the National Committee of Germany. So I start with my speech. So, dear colleagues, I'm proud to welcome you to this first IDF hybrid event of the year. It will be a real pleasure for me to meet those of you who have been able to physically attend activities of the Analytical Week after 2 years of disruption. Thankfully, during the most severe phases of the pandemic, the current technologies have allowed our well-motivated and committed experts to continue developing IDF ISO joint standards of quality for the dairy sector. However, nothing can replace human contact when it comes to building and developing relationships. Personal interactions and networking are the best way to generate and foster new ideas, and therefore, we look forward to hearing about the new developments, such as the IDF ICAR initiative on harmonizing the use of data from infrared technology. The meeting will be tomorrow. Notwithstanding, virtual option for those who haven't been able to attend in person will still allow them, as well as the rest of the community, to actively participate and engage in exchange thanks to the technical tools implemented by our hosts. I would like to warmly acknowledge the German National Committee of IDF for organizing this IDF ISO Analytical Week. It takes a great deal of courage and the resilience to host an event nowadays, and I truly congratulate them in that respect. So I ask an applause. The work performed by the 6 analytical IDF standing committees, jointly with the ISO Committee for Milk and Milk Products, is vital for the dairy sector. In effect, it is a fundamental work fully aligned with the 4 pillars of IDF: standards, safety and quality, nutrition and health, and sustainability. It also fits under most of the 9 strategic goals of the IDF Strategic Work Plan for 2022-2025, we implemented the last year, and we approved in October during the Global Dairy Congress in Copenhagen. In particular, those which aim at delivering benefits for the dairy sector by working with the intergovernmental organizations and non-governmental organizations, as well as those promoting and advocating food safety and quality. In this regard, I wish all of you a very fruitful and successful IDF ISO Analytical Week, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you all in person next year. So now I invite the next speaker, and I ask you to introduce yourself. Yes. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words to you in my capacity as chair of ISO TC34 Subcommittee 5, Milk and Milk Products, a task I accepted only last week. So I would like to thank Jurgen Jansen, who has been chairing this subcommittee for 4 years, and also Marcel de Vreese, secretary, to prepare this succession. So first of all, let me follow Pier Cristiano's words of welcome and take this opportunity to welcome you all on behalf of ISO to this Analytical Week 2022 in Constance. For most of you, I may be a familiar face, as I attended my first Analytical Week back to 2006 in Montreux, Switzerland. And that's only 3 hours drive from Constance. For those who know, my name is Hans Kruijsen. I'm from the Netherlands, and in my day job I work for Friesland Campina, the Netherlands, as an analytical chemical specialist. From origin, I'm a dairy technologist from Wageningen University, also the Netherlands, where I finished my master, both a master and also my PhD in dairy technology. Now I'm new in this capacity. I looked at the strategy of ISO organization, and I want to share some insight of the ISO strategy and bridge to the actual challenges and need for cooperation in the dairy analytical area. We operate in a world where change is a constant and where challenges can be global in scale. To be well positioned within the global context, we must have a clear strategy that defines our purpose, whilst allowing us to anticipate change and adapt quickly to the world around us. In ISO's role, over the next decade, we have identified 4 primary drivers for change as the areas where we see international standards having the most relevance in the world. That's the economy, technology, society, and environment. This leads to the vision of ISO, making lives easier, safer, and better. To realize our vision, our standards must be widely used. We need to ensure that our standards are high quality, easily accessible and usable, and that the people understand the benefits that they bring. We must listen to all voices, both the development of standards and when making decisions as an organization. We need to ensure that we attract, retain the best experts as we are here, and enable everyone to participate. To realize our vision, we must develop consensus-based standards that are relevant and respond to current and future challenges. We must focus on getting the right standards to the market at the right time, with the right content in the right format. In here you can see a snapshot of the ISO strategy. On the top you can see the vision of ISO, making lives easier, safer and better. On the left you can see the drivers for change I just mentioned in the introduction. The goals are in the middle of the priorities. Important is that during this week, with all the experts, we do capacity building by exchange information based on science. In this slide, you can see the work of ISO TC34, organized in 17 subcommittees, working over 140 countries with 900 published standards in food. These standards are on methods of analysis and sampling, product specifications and labeling, quality management, and on top, the important food safety and sustainability. The work of ISO TC 34 is organized in 17 subcommittees, both vertical within the sector, as for milk and milk products, and horizontal for all types of food. Cooperation with other subcommittees, marked in the sheet or with the asterisks, is of great importance. Here I want to mention SE9 on microbiology. With them we have a long track record, and a number of members of SE9 are also attending this meeting. Looking at the agenda, Looking at the agendas of this joint IDF ISO Analytical Week, I identified cooperation with all of these organizations active in standardization. It is therefore of great importance that organizations like IDF, ISO jointly make the effort to make progress in this dynamic playing field, also with other organizations. In the end, this creates value by alignment to regulatory frameworks and reducing the risk of trade disputes arising from the use of different analytical methods. As such, IDF-ISO collaboration to jointly contribute to the science-based development of harmonized standards, guidelines and codes of practice should be considered of great good, of major benefits to the global dairy industry. I shall round up. Now this week, lots of work lies ahead. I would like to thank the organizers for the great job done to make this hybrid symposium possible and for their great hospitality. As for you all, I wish you a very fruitful week with many moments of learnings, good discussions and wise decisions. For those here in Constance, I wish you a pleasant stay, enjoying the meetings, talks and networking opportunities, and no doubt further building of good relationships and friendships and many of your colleagues from all corners. I myself shall be around and look forward to meeting you in person and of course in the course of this week. Thank you very much. And I want to introduce Steve Holroyd from
Kia ora, I'm Steve Holroyd from New Zealand, and in my day job I'm an analytical chemist at Fonterra. It's a real pleasure to be here today and for this week, and I'd also like to thank our colleagues in the IDF Germany for organising this meeting, and the venue is fantastic, and we appreciate organising hybrid meetings is quite a challenge, so you've done a really good job and we look forward to a very productive week. Just want to give a little bit of introduction around standards. You know, we're all familiar with standards and they're in fact all around us. This is a slide from ISO that shows the variety of standards that you have in your life. They're often hidden, but to people in the dairy analytical microbiological community, they're not hidden. They're a really important part of our life. This is the IDF Strategy House. There's quite a lot going on in IDF. It's much broader than the methods of analysis and sampling forum that we have here. And I won't go through it in detail. The overall vision is helping to nourish the world with safe and sustainable dairy, and there's a number of parts to that, but it's principally around science-based guidance and a consensus for the global sector. And you can see other bullet points within that, but what I want to draw your attention to, there's three pillars around sustainability, nutrition and health, and dairy safety and quality, and they're underpinned by standards. So standards really underpin all that IDF does. We've already heard from Hans, my colleague, who's the Secretary of the ISO SC5. We've got a really important relationship between IDF and ISO for dairy standards, and this really underpins all that we do. We've got a formalised agreement. The meetings are held jointly, so this is a joint meeting of SC5 and the 6 IDF standing committees concerned with methods of analysis and sampling. We've got a lot of standards being published, and there's a large body of work that's going on as well. I should also mention it's our 20th anniversary. Last year was our 20th anniversary of this relationship that's been so productive. So what are the things that sort of come out of the projects that we're working on here? Well, the principal one is standards and also technical specifications or IDF reviewed methods. Up there's an example of a really important standard. It's got ISO and IDF numbers on it that you can see, and it's around the determination of nitrogen by Kaldal. Underpins our ability to measure protein in our products. A lot of work goes into those, both creating the original standard based on sound scientific principles, and also periodically every 5 years reviewing it to ensure it's up to date. But we do more than that. We also do things called the bulletin, which appear a bulletin of the IDF. And these are areas, they're not standards, but the areas we think we could align knowledge across a group. So a project team will create such a bulletin around a specific technical area. And we also do IDF fact sheets. These are smaller versions, IDF of around a specific area. This one's on nitrofurazone in dairy products as a marker for semicarbazide, as a banned antibiotic. These fact sheets are relatively short documents, still science-based, but they're quite brief, and they're often used by IDF to answer specific questions around a range of different areas, and they're available on the IDF website. Hans, again, has already mentioned the importance of liaisons. IDF and ISO is a really effective forum, but we're not the only people developing methods for food and specifically around dairy. So we have a number of other liaisons that are important to us, and also relationships with organisations like Codex, which we'll hear a little bit more about during the week as well. Other standards development organisations we also engage with, and IDF ISO has proven a really important forum for doing that and giving us that legitimacy. This is the Method Standards Steering Group. So I'm privileged to lead this group along with my colleagues Aurelie and Marcel from IDF and ISO respectively, and we've got our 6 chairs whose pictures you can see up there as well. So these are the 6 IDF standing committees that carry out the methods of analysis and sampling work under the aegis of IDF. There's 17 standing committees within IDF, 6 are concerned with methods of analysis and sampling, both in chemistry and microbiology, and between them they've got about 50 different projects that are actually really important, an important part of the activity IDF does. I'll just draw your attention, we do have, let's go back one. We do have a couple of vacant positions as deputy chairs here, and we're always really interested, and a really important part of what we do is attracting new people into the IDF ISO dairy community, because we need people to keep carrying out this work. I'd also like to thank my colleagues. It's a lot of work goes in the different areas, and as Hans again has already said, we've got a lot of work ahead of us this week, which we'll really enjoy. We've got a strategy around this Method Standard Steering Group, and there's a number of different things that we're actually focusing on over the next 2 to 4 years. Some of these we've already touched on and talked about. It's a relationship with ISO, which we've covered in a little bit of detail here. That's fundamental to what we do, the ability to publish joint standards. We also want to make sure that those standards are adequately recognised in the Codex Committee of Methods of Analysis and Sampling, and IDF has a really important role in ensuring that the voice of recognising good standards is heard at Codex level. Really promotes and assists international trade. We want to make sure the profile of the MSSG work is done through targeted communication with our colleagues at IDF. Really important to understand what we do, give visibility to it, and also understand with our respective employees the value of doing this work. We want to make sure we extend those collaborations and liaisons with other standards development organisations, which we've listed there. I've talked already about the experts. We need to make sure we've got a good quorum of effective experts, and we're bringing and encouraging others to join as well. And also promote the development of horizontal methods where that's appropriate. That's across wider groups than just dairy. So just to summarise then, future analytical weeks. We had a plan, and we've had a lot of discussions around what this looks like. We haven't got a host for next year's Analytical Week. If any country is really interested in hosting us, please get in touch very quickly, because we'd love to have a suitable host aligned quite shortly. We've also, tomorrow we're going to discuss a little bit more about what the forum looks like. Obviously, COVID has pushed us into having more hybrid meetings. We're really keen that we keep doing that. It works really well, but it's changed the game to some degree. Really important that ISO and IDF are recognised as reputable standards development organisations that use science to develop standards that are global. We also want to focus on IDF's priority areas, which we've touched on to some degree, and keep on with these our strategic partnerships and the liaisons that are so important to us as well. So that in the presentation, really appreciate both your presence here, your attendance at Analytical Week, and now I'll hand over to Barbara Gerten from Merck, who's going to actually get into the real important part of the session. Please.
To Pierre Cristiano and Hans for the nice welcome, greetings and introduction, first introduction. Together with Dr. Maximilian Moravec, also from Germany, we want to moderate the technical symposium today. My name is Barbara Gerten, I'm working at Merck. I'm the chair of the standing committee, thanks again, Steve, of the standing committee of harmonization of microbiological methods, and I'm also deputy chair of the German standardization body of the analytics of milk. And with this, I would like to hand over also to Dr. Maximilian Moravec.
Thank you, Barbara. My name is Maximilian Moravec. I'm a veterinary specialist in milk hygiene. I'm working for a commercial analytic laboratory, and I'm a member of two groups, SC-HMM and SC-AMDM. And we both want to welcome you for today's symposium, How Standardization Mirrors in Recent German Legislation and Dairy Business. And we are very happy to have such competent speakers on this topic. And this brings us to our first lecture. Mr. Patrick Liebe. Mr. Patrick Liebe studied dairy food microbial technology and worked in product development and quality management, and is now at the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture, and we'll talk about the new raw milk quality ordinance. Please.
Welcome, Patrick Liebe, and to his technical speech on the human health for consumers and fair payment for farmers, why and how German legislation regulates raw milk quality.
Thank you for the introduction. First of all, I also want to use the opportunity to deliver best wishes from the German Federal Minister of Food and Agriculture, Mr. Cem Özdemir. Sadly, his schedule didn't make it possible that he also gives some words to you, but he is aware of the Analytical Week and also on the importance of standardization. I myself want to talk over the German Rohmilchgüterverordnung. Translated, it would be the legislation on the quality of raw milk. Since it is a legislation, it's kind of hard to give it a one-by-one translation. So, considering the legislations, I will keep the German names. In this construct, I talk about the human health for consumers, and fair payment for farmers, why and how German legislation regulates raw milk quality, which you might even say, how can we even do this? What can we do to improve these points? Therefore, I will go on three main topics, since the whole legislation would be a little bit too much to present it here. It will be a short history on legislation, it will be the topic fair payment, and the last point will be the topic human health. Considering the short history, in the early 19th century, in the early 20th century, it was necessary that we start to take the quality of raw milk onto further consideration. Therefore, we started in Germany in 1930 with the first Milchgesetz, Act of Milk. So, as you see, the translations are not that good to understand. And it was established on the 31st of July 1930. And it was the first act that said that made penalties on the topic food fraud and also on the deception of consumers. It also made it a requirement for farmers to watch the hygienic standards, and it was also that this was the first requirement to do pasteurization on milk. Therefore, it was one of the first hygienic rules of this kind worldwide. The follow-up was the Gesetz über den Verkehr mit Milch, Milcherzeugnissen und Fetten, or translated, the Act on the Transport of Milk, Milk Products and Fats, which was established in 1951 and made further modifications on the Act of Milk and also took into consideration the EU, and therefore the EU also took over some of these points. Then in 1980, based on the two acts before, we established the Milchgüteverordnung, which many of you might know, the legislation on the quality of milk, which was legislation based on the before mentioned acts, and it was the first time that there was a connection between quality and payment for the farmer. And the last step on this was only 1 year ago, in July 2021, we established the new legislation on the quality of raw milk, so the Rohmilchgüteverordnung. This is also, as mentioned before, the topic now. I tried to diverse the topic fair payment into the chemical and physical analytics, which is not 100% correct, I know, but this is the best way to watch it. And later on we'll take the human health topic under the topic of the microbiology. As I mentioned before, what can we even do to support fair payment for the farmers? On legislative side, we have 3 points that might be an issue for us. On one side, we have to prove what are we even allowed to do via legislation. The second point is that we don't want to interrupt market economy, since this is not our job. And the third point is, as soon as we go into legislation with a quality standard, the industry takes this standard as a minimum standard. So we have to be quite careful on what we expect from the farmers. Therefore, we made a baseline. The baseline will be a milk with 4% fat and 3.4% protein. And based on this, we made it a requirement that deviations from this, be it positive or negative deviations, will be taken into consideration when you do the payment. And the second topic is the transparency. Even if it was already a topic in the old legislation on milk quality, it is made clearer that every farmer should be clearly understanding how his price, the price he gets for his milk, deviates from the average of dairy company. Therefore, the dairy company has to build an average of all prices they pay and communicate it to the farmer, so the farmer can see he is better than the average or he is worse than the average, and as a follow-up can check what has he to do to get better, to get more payment for his milk. And the last point is that we tried to encourage the dairy companies and the farmers to also take other quality parameters into consideration. As mentioned before, if we do it in the legislation, it gets to a standard. So what we can do is to say, have a look at it, have a look at lactose or other aspects, and discuss with each other if there's a possibility to give an additional payment for this. The next point, as mentioned, will be the human health and the microbiology. This is where I can also tell you a little more. I will go especially into the differences between EU requirements and German requirements. I'm saying additional requirements for microbiology, biology, where you can see that most of this requirement you see there, total plate count, somatic cell count, is already a requirement the European Union has. So where is the difference? We have a total plate count of below 100,000 in 2 samples per month over 2 months. We also have a somatic cell count below 400,000. I mean, it's the same as the European Union wants us to have. But the difference is the European Union waits 3 months. So only if you have not are in below this values for 3 months, There is a result that you are not prohibited to deliver milk to your dairy company anymore. And this is for time till you can prove that you are capable of fulfilling these requirements again. In Germany, we start from the first month on, not by saying you are prohibited to deliver milk, but to sanctionize it. With the aim that from begin on, we actively want to pressure the farmer that he starts to work against it, that he doesn't say, let's wait 1 month, 2 months. I mean, maybe the next month's average is acceptable again. He shall actively work on his hygienic on the farm and therefore work against this topic. So we want to him to be proactive instead of only following up. The next point is, and the last point, is the absence of inhibitors. Inhibitors for us is every substance that is capable to reduce the work of cultures and etc. Mainly this will be antibiotics, but there are also cleaning agents, etc. that can have a similar work. Therefore, we in Germany have the same maximum residue levels as communicated via the European Union. But while the European Union only says you are prohibited to have content over a specific MRL, we also try to tell how they can check it and what they can do against it. Therefore, we have the requirement of a rapid test with every delivery from a farmer to a dairy company. And as soon as this rapid test is positive, you have to follow up with a complete analytic of the milk to check what was, if the ML really is, I know, missing the word, if you are really above the MLs. The rapid test in Germany only has the requirement to be sensitive on penicillin and cephalosporin. Therefore, you see that there are a lot of open gaps on the rapid test, but since over 90% of the used antibiotics in Germany are belonging to those two groups, it is a good first indicator. In addition to this, why you have to do this on every sample, 4 times a month you have to do an antibiotic test on penicillins, cephalosporins, aminoglycosides, macrolides and lincosamides, sulfonamides and tetracyclines. Another addition is that you have to do 2 times a year a check on quinolones. Only 2 times a year, since sampling or the method is quite expensive to the actual moment, and we only want to do some sort of monitoring here. Considering the test system, we have an additional requirement, which is to have an approved laboratory. So it is not possible that the dairy company has the final word on if there is antibiotics or if there is an inhibitor in the milk or not. The final word is by an approved laboratory to have a neutral status here. If a dairy company of a farmer says, I have an inhibitor in my milk, then there's always a little risk that the farmer says, oh, but it might be just your interest to say so, but if it is it really the case? To prevent this, we directly go to a neutral state, which is the approved laboratory. Another addition is, since the old legislation on the quality of milk required a microbiological test, in this case a Brillant-Schwarz-Reduktionstest, the new legislation lets this point quite open. We have different sponsors also out here who use different methods than microbiological methods. Those would also be allowed inside the legislation on the quality of raw milk, and therefore we want to also give away for the future, to not stuck on this microbiological topic for every time. Yeah, that was considering these topics as a short summary already. I mean, we as legislative can give you a lot of requirements for milk to fulfill, but all those requirements are useless if not groups like the IDF and the ISO develop methods for standard methods that are internationally used to check if those requirements we give to the farmers are really fulfilled. So again, I want to thank this group here that she takes the responsibility to develop such methods, and hope that there will be a constructive discussion during this next 2 days. I wanted to leave a little time open for questions and discussions. Maybe the time left open now is a little bit too long since I talked too fast, but if there are any questions, feel free.
Yeah, thank you very much, Patrick, for the also for the background of the history and the long history, and now the new developments. And we are open for your questions. Would be great if you could give your name before starting the questions.
No question. Okay.
Okay.
Here,
Yeah,
please
thank
wait.
you.
We have microphones. Just wait for the microphone.
Is it working?
Harry van Bijgaard, Tulip, Netherlands. I was listening to your talk. You explained nicely the history of the regulations in Germany. What I was missing a bit was the involvement of the dairies and the farmers, because there's interest with dairies and farmers to have hygiene properly arranged for and being promoted with dairy farmers too. How have they influenced, how are they involved in the making of the regulations in Germany, or better, how is that arranged currently?
In this case, I can only talk of the newest legislation from 2021. There we had discussion rounds with the different farmer groups as well as the dairy groups. Since this is a technical regulation, we can't do others. We are sitting in offices, sure we have a background, but we need to discuss the actual state with them to find a proper solution. This was also done here. The problem with this is always that you will never be capable to make both sides fully happy, since the interests are simply different. In addition to this, the German legislative system requires us to send an email to all groups if they have any additions or if they want any changes which have to be taken into consideration. This was also done here. And the result of this consultation and the result of this quite long time in development of the legislation resulted in the final.
Maybe we have some questions in the chat. Is there someone? No? Okay. I have one question. Okay, sorry, yeah.
Okay, Wim Rijbroek, Ilvo, Belgium. I was a little bit surprised about your remark about the kinderloons, the detection of kinderloons. Mm-hmm. Since in the 80s, Gertraud Suren from Kiel here in Germany, she developed a bacteriological inhibitor test based on Escherichia coli that each lab can produce itself, making the cost less than 10 euro cents per sample and detecting all the kinderloons below 10 ppb.
Yeah, the point is exactly those 10 euros. We take kinolones into consideration with a monitoring 2 times a year, but if we would have the same the same requirement as for the other antibiotics. We would be at 4 times a month, which would be 40 euros per month just for quinolones. And this was a point where we have been a little critical how the farmers would react to it, and also in the discussions with the farmers where the last question went to, we would always get the feedback that this is not acceptable. So we try to find a good way in between to, on one side, have proper monitoring, especially since quinolones are not that often used here in Germany, and the requirement to check for it. I hope this will.
And for me, 5 times 10 euro cents is half a euro, not 5 euro or 10 euro.
But you said 10 euros per test, if I...
No. 10 euro cent per test if you produce the kit yourself.
Okay,
yeah.
this was new to me. The cheapest tests I found out and also got mentioned towards me were at around 7 euros per full test. And this was in a range where we had to find a proper solution, which for us has been the monitoring.
So, Markus Albrecht from Milchprüfing Baden-Württemberg. We know the test from Kiel. The problem is you have a fresh test each day or each week. It was not stable to use this test in a milk recording or a milk payment lab. So, and this, at the moment, we testing in German a new test from the IM. You can connect. It's the marketing part now on the traditional test. So we have in the future a microprobable test for quinolones. But the test from Kiel was not stable enough for the daily work in the milk labs.
That's one part I may have missed in the presentation, that sure, all tests used have to be validated. This is one of the additional requirements, but as mentioned, I try to dig not too deep into the legislation, since we also have it here. You would have been a little longer.
Schilling-Firma Christian Hansen, da habe ich gleich auch noch eine Frage zu. Validiert.
In English, please, if it's possible,
sorry,
please in English. But we can translate also, no problem.
I'm sorry.
Thank you so much.
So I have a question regarding the validation. Where should it validate? Which institute, which lab, or?
There is no requirement, there is no specific lab to do this. Yeah. The approved laboratory is in their own responsibility. This means during the complete legislation on the quality of raw milk, we have always an official method that can be used, and also other methods. This gets especially important considering the inhibitors. In most other cases, be it chemical, physical, or microbiological methods, we have an official one. In the inhibitors, we would have quite a bunch of different methods that have to be combined, and therefore, in this case, the other methods are far more important. Means on one side, you could use a combination of different official methods, but this would be far too long from the timing how to do it. But you can also use an own, we call it Hemshoff test system, so a mixture of one or more methods that you have to validate yourself in the combination it gives.
So that means a supplier can validate it by himself?
Yes.
Does it make sense?
If it is,
does it not should be an external, unabhängig lab, auditing?
Independent lab?
Independent, yeah.
If it is a problem with an independent lab, if we, for example, via the Max Rubner Institute would do so, we might lead the direction too much into one specific method from one producer. That's why we want to leave this open, and the laboratories to reuse this test. In general, the responsibility to have a validation is the responsibility of the laboratory. The laboratory has to be approved on the one side from the government, on the other side it has to be DIN accredited. And therefore we think that the laboratory has the capability to check if the validation is acceptable, that that everything they get from the producer is sufficient, or if they themselves have to add something.
Christian Baumgartner, maybe I can assist because this is really innovative in this regulation. We have the criteria approach. So there's a list of substances which has to be detected on a certain level, and each method showing that they can do this is applicable. And of course, we have an ISO and IDF method how to validate such tests, and you are free to select an independent organization to do so. So I know from IEM, it's a Nordval validation. You deliver all the data, and then it's independently checked, and you can arrive at the validation. So I think, I noticed you before, so I think this raw milk regulation is really innovative in many ways. And this is one of it, because we have a criteria approach really translated into legislation.
I'm Silvia Orlandini from ICAR, and in this aspect I was involved in the last year for different projects. And just today I checked that I have the stick of the Analytical Week in Berlin 2014, and we discussed during that meeting the difference from validation and verification, and this we are introducing this wording in our ISO standard. Really, to do a validation or to expect that a single routine lab do a complete validation, for example, for an inhibitor test, is almost impossible. It's a huge work if you are speaking technically seriously. So what we can ask to a routine lab is to do a verification. So he receives a validated product, and he verify, for example, that this product fulfill the requirement described by the producer. This is the only things that a routine lab can do. There are, in our guidelines, we know we are developing, we are publishing, there are a lot of requirements. So it's really have to be clear. So if we speak about validation, as validation have to be done by the best could be that is an organization that is accredited 70065. This could be the best. But so at the moment in our ISO standard, we are reporting that should be expert enough and have to have all the resources to do such study. So it's really distinguished these two wording. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Then
Thanks.
Barbara will lead to the next speaker.
Yes, thank you very much. We have from the chat and Marcel. And also I want to ask if there is any chat.
Yeah, a small question. I'm Marcel de Vreese from the Netherlands. In your summary, you mentioned the growing importance of the relatively new standards IFS and FSSC. I believe they are food safety management standards. Can you say something about how they are considered here in Germany? Are they mandatory by the government or not mandatory by the government, or completely voluntary or mandatory in the market? Can you say something about those, the status of these standards?
It depends a little. FSSC is a requirement, especially by the market, same as IFS. Since the trade organizations like Lidl and Aldi see it as a requirement that the dairy factory that produces their products is certified in this way. From governmental sides, the requirement is only that you use specific methods for specific samples or values to check them, which are quite open to have additions later on. But FSSC and IFS are only on the industrial side. So we don't require them from us. As mentioned in the beginning, every requirement we as a legislative add will lead to that someone it is said, oh, this is a legislative requirement, so this is standard, this is something everyone needs, and therefore there is no differentiation to have the possibility to get additional payment or additional marketing out of it.
Question from Christian Hansen. Can you elaborate on the inhibiting substances and how you require documentation or transparency in those tests that's actually taking place and so on?
The maximum residue levels on the inhibitors are the same as on the European level. So the European Union already has maximum residues on antibiotics, which we took over. The main difference is the way you test for them. So the European Union requires a method used on milk, and only if you dig a little deeper, you can see that the requirement is on a single cow, the milk of a single cow, where the method or where.
Maybe you could clarify a little bit also what documentation requirements the dairies are supposed to follow. So how do you want them to document that the test is actually taking place and the results they get in is positive or negative in this case?
For the dairies, it is no requirement to do a full test. That's what I mean. The dairy only has the responsibility to do a rapid test with every delivery, but the really important test is done by an approved laboratory. This is the test done 4 times a month, which results in that we want a neutral place to do this, since the follow-up of if you are above this MRLs is that you are sanctionized, that you have that you get 3 cents per kg of milk per for 1 month less. And therefore the requirement is on the laboratories. There are a lot of dairy companies who do themselves test on an additional test just to be sure themselves or to start earlier with the production. And as mentioned, the rapid test, which has to be, I don't know how many years, I think it was 5 years to be, the documentation on the testing that it has to be 5 years stored. But I'm not really sure on the time. I would have to read it up.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
From the chat?
Chat?
From the chat?
No? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Liebe.
Thanks.
Thank you. And we want to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Christian Baumgartner, who is a veterinarian doctor by education, and he worked as a managing director at Milchprüfring Bayern for a very long time, from 1996 to 2021. And he is also an active member in various international working groups, especially on the detection of antibiotic residue. So it's very good that we had also this discussion before. And here he is active since more than 20 years. And now he's started an active role as entrepreneurship in 2018 with founding Milchpur Medien GmbH, providing an online information platform for dairy farmers and dairy specialists. Welcome, Christian, and we are looking forward to your presentation on the German legislation and IDF ISO standardization, the application of IDF ISO standards in practice.
Thank you. Yeah, welcome to you all. And I'm blessed for many reasons now because I also have more time to talk. So I'm tempted to talk slower, but I think it's not a good idea. I will go further. So yeah, I'm grateful to be here, to have the opportunity to give this speech because, as it was mentioned, I was working for NPR for many years, and I had, from the practical side, to deal with this issue of how to transfer the standards into practice. it's also an opportunity to show what we have achieved over the last 2.5 decades, and fair to say that there are still some areas under construction which need some attention in the future. And I told to Mr. Liebe, it's not a critic mentioning this, but just a matter of continuous improvement. So even we in Germany can do better in the future as we do at the moment. So, of course, my side may be a bit biased because I was working for an organization dealing with the economic side, so the milk payment and quality analysis. And close to the history of Milchgesetz, MPR was founded in 1935. So it's quite a traditional thing in our lab to deal with those issues. And it has always been also a matter of food safety. The difference is 25 years ago, you were not allowed to talk about that because it was a split area of legislation. But in the end, talking about milk quality is always talking about food safety and about consumer protection. What is a good development, and now we are under a big umbrella. Mr. Liebe comes from the Federal Ministry of Food, Agriculture and Consumer Protection. So dealing with these topics now is really under one roof and in one house. So, of course, I have to give some historical background. Maybe it's more historical background than else, but it highlights what happened in Germany with the practical use of the standards. So the Güteverordnung was introduced. It was issued in 1980, came into effect 81, and it really set the standard for those parameters. So for fat, protein, for somatic cell count, and quite a nice thing in Germany, we don't talk about inhibitors in the legislation. We are talking about the microbiological quality of milk, which consists of total bacteria count and the question, are there inhibitory substances in it? So in terms of analytical methods, they were described in annexes. So there were annex for Röse-Gottlieb. In fact, it was the well-known methods, but which was special, in Germany, we wrote the method in the annex of the regulation. So even if, and I learned IDF issued the first Röse-Gottlieb method in 1955, and ISO, as far as I know, took it on board in 1970, the German regulators thought it's a good idea to refer to the standards. They just wrote the method in the annex of the law. But this was the economic side of the business. We also had the food protection side. The regulation is Lebensmittel- und Bedarfsgegenständegesetz, and this law also has a collection of methods. In former times, it was a paragraph 35 collection. I think all of you know that type. So the method for Röse-Gottlieb there has the code L01.009. It's a Röse-Gottlieb method, but in connection with the food hygiene law. So for us as lab, what to do? At that time, it was quite easy because MPR was responsible for Güteverordnung. Of course, we had to take the annex of the Güteverordnung. I didn't check really letter by letter what was the difference between the methods, but you can be sure there were differences. But this highlights we have two completely different areas of legislation. We had two different areas of legislation. It was the economical side and the food law side. And I remember starting in MPR, and one of my first presentations, I talked about the quality parameters and I talked about residues of antibiotics. It was a bad idea. Immediately, I got some messages from ministry in Bavaria, don't talk about residues of antibiotics because we don't search for residue of antibiotics, we are searching for inhibitors. And this is completely different because this is economic law. We are in touch or in charge of doing food law. This you have to understand also when we talk about the implementation of the standards at that side. Of course, then two important new factors came into the game. It was mentioned the EU legislation, so we have two directives, council directives, the first one in '85, dealing mainly at that time also with prevention of the spread of infectious diseases by milk, or at that time dairy products. Foot and mouth disease was a big issue at that time. And in '92, there was another one, the first one setting a standard for thresholds. So at that time, it was a threshold for total bacteria count and for somatic cell count. And the vision that in the future the national states have to implement these rules. And in that time, the 92-46 was the first time mentioning raw milk, really. And why? Because the international trade, or the trade between the EU countries, enlarged and got more and more. So this had, of course, an enormous effect on the legislation, because you had to take into consideration. These were directives, not immediately valid, but the German legislation had to take into account these directives. In terms of methods, the transition or the translation of these directives in Germany was the Milchverordnung. It was a special regulation, only it was food regulation, but only for milk and milk products. Very important, because that was the start of my career at NPR. It was the first time when it was mandatory that the farms had to be checked. So you had to do on-farm audits, and most of the farmers did not really understand that. If the result is good, the total bacteria count, why do you want to see what I'm doing? So this was really an innovation. Of course, we at NPR, we prepared for this regulation because the directive was clear in '92. So when the Milchverordnung came into effect, of course, we were prepared to do the work on somatic cell count and of total bacteria count. The analytical methods, just briefly, because you can talk for days about this development, the somatic cell count with the phosomatic in our case, with the FOSS instrument, started already in 1980. It was the disk method at that time. And then, of course, the instruments improved and the throughput also improved. So the first machines having around 150, 180 samples per hour. Now we are doing 500 samples or up to 600, it depends. So this was another effect. So if you are claiming you have to do some analysis 4 times per month, you have to have the capacity for that. And in '85, '90, there were in Bavaria around 100,000 farmers. Total bacteria count, the Bactoscan started a bit later in 1990. At that time, there was an indirect method doing analysis for pyruvet. It's a metabolic substance the bacteria produce when they are growing. So it was an indirect parameter for the bacteriological quality of milk. Of course, today we are using FC methods, but what is clear, at that time, these automated methods didn't have any representation in the standardization. If you want to use it, you had to do a validation study, and here the method comes into account or in the scene, because we had to choose, okay, what method to use to do the validation, to show that you are equivalent. And then this red one really became a question, because we are not working only for commercial analysis, but also for food hygiene reasons. So, okay, we made the right decision, I guess, at NPR, but it was not always consistent with the legislation. And then, of course, a factor in the late 90s came accreditation, and that put another focus on the methods, because if you are an accredited lab, you have to show consistency and also traceability to internationally acknowledged methods. And with the German legislation behind it was not always so easy. Now I've prepared a first example referring to the standards, to the method. So at that time, NPR used the cryoscopes from Funke Gerber according to the method in the food hygiene, the L, you see 01.0029. During the 90s, there were many problems for the Bavarian dairy companies exporting milk to Italy because many trucks were stopped at the border and they failed the freezing point value, being minus 0.520 at that time. It was a drinking milk audience, a European one. And they always complained and they did not know, and maybe Pierre Cristiano, you know the story, yeah? After some years, we said, okay, we have to compare what is going wrong. And the comparison showed that the main difference, the reason for difference was a method one. It was in the method because the two producers of the instruments used different shaft materials. And as far as I know, Harry was the project leader at that time. It was a systematic difference from up to 0.007 degrees, which is huge if you're talking about the minus 520. Okay, the result was that the ISO standard was revised, and in 2002 it was the second standard issued, taking into account the problems. But lacking this dynamic referencing in German legislation, the method which was valid in German legislation did not move or change. So looking at the timeline, we have this method, the German national one, the green one, the ISO, and the ISO was issued, as far as I saw, in 87, the German one in 88. I did not cross-check, but maybe they were very similar, of course. When the ISO revision was issued, the German legislator or the responsible organization for the method just made a correction. So they did not change the whole standard, they made an amendment. And the third revision of the ISO standard was issued in 2009, and it took only 10 years in Germany. There's no critic. When this standard was accepted now as a DIN EN ISO standard means that they are really equivalent. So the method in the collection of food hygiene is really equivalent to the ISO standard, which should be the case, I guess. So, and of course, and this is one of the boxes to tick, it's really an Erfolg, a success of this work in the standardization that now we have this situation. To understand why this is the case, I want to give you only one slide of organizational background, because Germany is really, and I learned during the last years, really a huge country in terms of organizations and in terms what is necessary to do so. So even now we have this roof or this umbrella above the whole sector. There is a federal office for consumer protection and food safety, the BVL it's called. It's an agency of this ministry which has a huge task, so especially for risk management and risk communication. So you can hear from these two expressions that the origin was in the EU food hygiene strategy coming in 2000. So this was a new organization for Germany. And this organization is responsible for the collection of methods now laid down in the paragraph 64 of the German Food and Feed Act. This is a huge collection of every method used in the food and feed analysis. And this BVL as well hosts the coordination office in Germany to implement the different legislation in different fields. And milk is only a very small of all of that. But BVL is not doing the technical work. The technical work is done in DIN. I think everybody of you knows DIN. And DIN is a member of ISO since 1951. I saw at the website. but which was a pity for many years. In the TC34 SC5, Germany was only observing member, which had the result that all things happening in ISO were not so closely followed up. So, and thankfully for initiatives of some people in the last years, now Germany is, and DIN is a member of this SC5, and I think this will really improve the situation a lot. But DIN is in itself a huge organization, so the responsible Ausschuss, committee, is the DIN-Normenausschuss Lebensmittel- und landwirtschaftliche Produkte, NAL, which deals with everything doing with agriculture and food. And a subcommittee of that is the Committee on Milk and Milk Products. It's the MAS, the responsible organization for methods for analysis and sampling. And there's some more. So we also have an organization of research labs working in the agricultural field, and they are issuing an own collection of methods, which is very valuable. And of course, it has to be combined somehow with the DIN methods. So it's quite complicated. And of course, what do I want to say with that? I think that communication really is an issue and could be improved, and I can say one of the boxes to tick that it has improved a lot during the last years. It was completely different 20 years ago. So people talk to each other. Okay, another example, and it's the last one, total bacteria count. And this is one of the areas still under construction, you will see. As we were using total bacteria count, the Bactuscan, it's an automated method, and you have to refer to a reference method. So you cannot use, or at least for German situation, you cannot use the impulses coming from the machines directly. You have to translate that into colony forming units. This was done in Germany as well as in other countries, and this resulted in different characteristics of conversion to do this job. And during the 1990s, this total bacteria count was new for Bavarian farmers. This was introduced to them. We had some years of experience. And then we entered into the late 90s, where the trade between the countries became more and stronger. And we had situations where German farmers, they changed their dairy company and went to Belgium or to Luxembourg, and they realized there's something different. And I brought for you a selection of conversion characteristics from the year 2005, so we are far away from that. Maybe the situation is not completely different, but that's old data. And if you look, we have the Bactuscan impulses on the x-axis and the colony forming units on the y-axis. There are quite different characteristics. And if you draw the line, there's the 100,000 CFU, which are relevant for the farmers, for the payment. You can see, depending where you start or where you fix your Bactuscan impulses, with the same milk going to different countries, you get completely different results in terms of CFU. Always have in mind that the Bactuscan impulse is the same. So analytic works, but the translation into the relevant parameters has some problems. And you can imagine, and some of you will remember very well, there was an outcry in Germany, a political outcry. Even the federal minister stepped into that and said, okay, wait a minute, we cannot apply this conversion. And it took us until 2015, as far as I remember, to really have this unified conversion in Germany only, because I have to confess, in Bavaria, the farmers also resisted to adopt a new conversion because they know that the colleagues in other countries are treated much better than they are. So to add the last point to the historical background, of course, there was something going on at the end of the 90s, and I don't know if you have in mind what was it, which changed the EU perception of food hygiene completely. It was the BSE crisis. And this was the reason why EU issued the new food hygiene strategy in 2000, the White Book, and then in the following years, in 2006, the collection of food hygiene regulations, which are immediately valid in each member country. So we have a new situation because you cannot transfer EU directives into German law. You have law immediately valid for us. And of course, this changed the game. And Mr. Liebe presented one of the results, Rohmilchgüteverordnung, this, I think, very good combination of the food hygiene regulations and the German special law. And of course, there was only one paragraph saying that now this regime we are doing in the Rohmilchgüteverordnung is the national control regime for the EU food hygiene legislation. And this is perfect because it unifies two sectors which were completely separated before, but we are doing hundreds of thousands or even millions of tests per year on somatic cell count and on total bacteria count. And before they were not relevant for the food hygiene law, now they are. And this is the really good news for me, Mr. Liebe. Now we have, via this bracket of European law, also a unified situation in Germany. And I envisage that for the future and under one umbrella of the federal ministry, this will make many things easier in the future for the labs. The last point of this story, as we have these different conversions for total bacteria count, there was much work done on that until 2016. So this is one area under construction. And there's a report of 2016 from ANSES, at that time being the EU reference lab for milk and milk products. They did a great job together with other national reference labs. And they made a report about the harmonization of conversion in Europe. The pity was that EU decided not to give money to this work anymore. And so the whole thing was cancelled and stopped. So ANSES doesn't have a role of a reference lab, and in Germany, as consequence, we don't have a German reference lab for milk and milk products anymore. What is clear because the EU structure is missing. But this is still waiting. And I don't know, maybe there are some people in the room to pick up this item and is really ready, a unified conversion in Europe. It's not set into effect. And that's a pity because we have the same threshold, 100,000 total bacteria count for every farmer in 27 countries in Europe. But the main job to transfer the IBC into CFUs is different. And the solution is on the table, but we don't have it in effect. So maybe it could be an activity or an action on the political side to go the last step in that area. So I have some messages for you, and maybe this is also a summary of 26 years of my work in MPR, and yeah, sooner or later leaving also this community. For the younger colleagues in the audience, once you are challenged, do what you think what is right. Not what fits into the system, but to your best knowledge, do these things. You say, okay, I can relate to that, and that is true, and this is my best knowledge. For the representatives of authorities and organizations, it's an experience. Analytics is not a democratic procedure. It's a scientific one. If a result is correct or not it's not a matter of majorities. But, of course, standardization is a democratic process, because here we need the consensus, and it's more a matter of coordination and of many other things. Of course, it should be based on science, which is no longer clear since this Mr. Trump was president in the US. But anyhow, science should be the basis, so otherwise we lose ground. I think I don't have to tell that in that room. And this, I guess, is the real interesting task for the future. You have this science-based thing, and you have to look for scientific ground, but then you go to the political process, and you should make something out of that. And the last slide, I think Germany has gone a long way to implement the ISO and IDF standards directly in national legislation, and we discussed why it's not happening so easily, because no legislator in this world will give the responsibility what's in the legislation to a third party. They always want to have and must have maybe control about what is ruled in the national legislation. But I think in nowadays world, in being so interdependent and internationally connected, I think this attitude should be changed in a way. So means I think we need more dynamic references. Just say for us, the rule is the ISO standard XYZ, and it's done. Of course, this will promote transparency and consistency for all stakeholders. And now for ISO IDF, and I experienced that for more than 20 years now. It's a great community of experts, and many of you became friends over the years. And I think this work is really, you cannot pay for that with any money. We have the tools to secure the equivalence internationally, and some project like our reference system for somatic cell counting you will present after the break is really a great success, because you can visually see by the results what happens if you join together and join the forces. Yeah. So let's use these preconditions we have wisely, because then I think we add another step into a very bright future. So thank you for your attention. So I wanted to show you the view I have every week when I go uphill, but okay, it's gone. Okay. It's in the Bavarian Wood, direction east to the Czech Republic. Can invite you to come to Waldkirchen.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
It's just a remark. So long the collecting regime is different in different countries, you cannot come to one uniform conversion line, because like in my country, in Belgium, we collect every 3 days. So you have more psychotrophic bacteria, and these bacteria have a different clump factor. So you cannot have the same conversion and use the same conversion line in countries where they collect every day.
Yeah, it's a valid remark, but of course this applies also to Germany. So we have completely different collection rules, or the size of the farms, everything, every factor we discussed in the past can be a valid factor. But of course you have to make the decision, what do you want to do? You can have 15 different conversion factors, but please not according to nationality, then according to collection periods and the really valid factors influencing the conversion. Mm-hmm. This is the message.
Yeah, but that's part of the problem. Yeah.
Of course, the problem is huge. Please don't think that it's an easy thing. And I remember my first meeting I had with Professor Hegen. It was in 1996 in Austria for an IDF meeting. And at that time, so drinking coffee, he said, young colleague, and we touched this item of conversion. He said, okay, I have at least 4 or 5 conversion tables in my office, but I cannot show to anybody. So it's 25 years.
Okay, anything else? I have one question. You've talked about 26 years at NPR. What was the major changes in these 26 years?
It feels more than a day because maybe you got an expression the environment was completely different for us as a lab, as an organization, from the funding. So most of the funding came from ministry, from official money. Today it's a private organization, contracts with dairy companies, and I may address you, Alfred Enderles, the new CEO, is completely different organization. Many people don't realize yet, but of course it's a complete different environment. And as I said, the EU legislation and all this was not present in '95. So I think maybe it's not fair to really compare the times because it's another world. And think only of accreditation, of all you can do with electronic means today. During the week we will talk about use of FTIR spectra is completely different to what happened 20 years ago. So for the fat analysis we had an IR instrument with one filter, it was one wavelength. Now we are using 1,000 or 700. At that time you couldn't have an idea to even process this with a computer. That's completely, yeah. So I prefer not to compare the 25 years.
Another question, yes, please.
Hi, Christian. Barry Stewart here from Ireland. Just going to ask you a question slightly off topic, but because, of course, you started out as a veterinarian. Obviously, antimicrobial resistance is a big topic just coming down the line. Here in Ireland, I actually come from a dairy farm and I'm also working in the industry. And this year, we've been told this last year that we can use antibiotics on all our cows when it comes to the dry-off period. But there has been a massive shortfall in terms of the message being told to the farmers and the framework that's put in place to actually enforce what the government and the wider industry want us to do to cut down on the amount of antibiotics being used. So I'm just wondering, what's your experience of it, I suppose, in Germany and the industry as a whole on the continent?
Of course, it's a big topic. And maybe this relates to the question quinolones or such types of antibiotics, because the problem really gets smaller because use of quinolones, for example, is regulated so heavily. It's really a high stake to use quinolones at all. If you want to do, you have to take a sample, you have to do the antimicrobial resistance test, so the vets as well as the farmers, they avoid using the quinolones if possible. And so, as far as I know, there were 2 runs of screening for quinolones. There was no positive so far, which all in all is not a surprise because the frequency of positive tests in raw milk is so low. In Germany, in Bavaria, we have 0.02 positives. So if you're doing 100,000 tests, you find around 20. And for that reason, what is good, yeah, you reduce the frequency of positive findings so low, but then talking about that as a problem is not really valid. It doesn't mirror the situation of food production. But for the farmer, of course, drying off of cows with antibiotic use, I think it's not longer the good agricultural practice. So you have to select the cows, and you have to give, as you should do as a vet, a course for treatment, an indication. And so that's a big discussion. Is it valid in our days to use antibiotics without this single indication for a single animal? There are some situations, I think it's still valid if you have a group of calves and you see you have a virus infection going through and it starts that the calves are really suffering from that. It's maybe a good idea to treat the whole group, but there should be a sound indication for that. So in total, I think the relevance of antibiotic use in animals is overestimated when it comes to cows and to dairy cows especially. And as far as I know, many studies show that the resistant germs you find in humans are very rarely directly, linked to some animal strains. And there's still some discussion going on, and there is scientific proof to be done that the relevance of these we can discuss, and in general you should avoid, of course, but the relevance really for a sick person in the hospital suffering from a resistant strain, what is the connection? And all these types of discussions we have, of course, it can be a contribution to distribute this type of plasmids or of resistance genes. You should avoid. But what is really the background if you have a sick person in the hospital? You know, the pets play a very important role as well, and the spread between human beings, of course, as well. And the use of antibiotics in humans is not as regulated as we think. And I think it's better regulated in the dairy business. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah, no, it's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. We have also a question from the audience. I will read it if you allow. I can see it here on the screen. So thank you, Christian Baumgartner. It is from Su Yao from China. She is also chair of the standing committee AMDM. Science and technology are very important to standards. And standards have to maybe balance the interests of all parties, of course. What new technologies do you think could be used in the future to accurately count living bacteria? And how about the application of these technologies? Thanks, Sue, for your great question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm afraid I cannot really answer that because I'm not a bacteriologist. And my first temptation to answer is let's use what we have at the moment wisely and really implement that in practice before we go to new methods. Because what we have is not so bad. And the purpose of total bacteria counting for raw milk quality, for example, I think the method, FC methods we have are valid. The problem is this translation into colony forming units. Maybe we should lead a discussion if this in the future still should be necessary. Why to translate into colony forming units if we can count single bacteria? And I think in Switzerland, I think there was work for that. So why not to set a threshold, IBCs, and this is the legal relevant threshold. If you are above, you are failing. If you are below, it's okay. It could be another approach. So I would rather answer, let's not look for new methods. Let's change our system. We are applying the methods we have. Because that would be another take-home message, or one of my favorites. We have a problem of tools. It's somehow a misunderstanding. So many people have a tool and they use it and they think about what can we do with the results. No, you should identify the problem, the question you have, and then select the correct tool which can answer your question. And this means before asking for a method, I should know what do I want to know. And I think for 20 years discussions in ISO, it's always appearing the same question. In the end, if you're discussing, okay, what do we want to know? What is really the trait we are looking for? And it was not very rare that people couldn't really answer this question. So this would really be a good idea to sit down and be clear what you want to know.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christiana. Any other questions, remarks from here, from the audience, or also from the audience per web? If not, thanks also from my side on behalf of the standardization for your clear explanation of the very complicated situation, which is not only in Germany, it's different from country to country, but especially using European and ISO methods, EN ISO methods, maybe it makes life a little bit easier for the future. Thanks a lot, Christian.
Yeah, thank you.
One moment.
So we have time for a small break for half an hour. So we will see us at 4 p.m. And yeah, have a good break.